Augustine, Part 1.
Welcome back. In the last lecture, we examined the athletes of God, which is to say, Christian ascetics of late antiquity. We examined the emergence of monasticism from the deserts of Egypt, and we took a look at some of the arguments that are articulated about the relative merits of virginity and celibacy and marriage in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Today we're going to examine the most famous thinker of late antiquity, St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo. Of all the people who lived during the 4th and early 5th centuries, Augustine is the one whom we know the most intimately. And this is thanks in part to a spiritual autobiography that he wrote, called The Confessions. Augustine wrote The Confessions, which has some claim to being the first autobiography ever written in Western literature, when he was about 43 years old. This is a problem for historians because he did not die upon completion of this work, so much of his life goes unchronicled in The Confessions. And The Confessions is a problematic text in some ways because it recounts Augustine's spiritual journey toward Christianity. As a result, Augustine will go into great length over events that historians are perhaps not overly interested in, such as his theft of pears when he was an adolescent. But he will neglect details that historians would dearly love to know. For example, he never tells us the name of the concubine with whom he lived for about 15 years. And if any listeners ever discover this name, please let me know immediately. We'll be rich and famous together. He barely mentions his brother, and we think he might have had 2 sisters based on what he says in the Confessions, but it's not entirely clear. Much of his family life does not appear in this spiritual autobiography. Nonetheless, despite its limitations as a historical document, the Confessions opens up a remarkable window into the mind of an individual who lived during the 4th and the 5th centuries. We also know Augustine unusually well because he accidentally did us a huge favor shortly before his death. He dies in 430, and in 428 he wrote down a list of everything he had written up to that point in time, which is to say most of his vast corpus, and he indicated the date at which he wrote each of these works in the precise order in which he had written them. Now, when studying an ancient thinker such as Plato or Aristotle, there's always considerable argument over what order these books should be placed in order to trace the evolution of Plato's thinking, for example. Augustine made it clear for us. We know exactly what he wrote, when he wrote, and based on this list, we are confident that we possess today virtually everything that Augustine wrote, that almost nothing has perished. So we have an almost complete overview of his thinking at various points in time. And it is very well that we have this spiritual autobiography and this marvelous list of his writings, because Augustinian thought was going to be an incredibly powerful influence in Europe for well over a millennium. And Augustine's ideas about human nature, about history, about Rome and classical culture and paganism, on the relations between religious and secular authority, are going to be read and debated and argued over for a long time to come. Augustine is born in 354, and he's a North African. He comes from Algeria, born in the town of Thasgate. He's a citizen of the Roman Empire, but he's a provincial and feels his provincial background somewhat keenly throughout his life. He comes from a relatively modest family of some local importance, but certainly not of great imperial importance. His father is a pagan by the name of Patricius. He is a member of the local town council, so he's a relatively important figure in the hometown, but outside of that town, no one would have known who he was. He seems to have been a relatively remote figure in Augustine's early life. His mother is a Christian by the name of Monica, and Monica was a very pious and devout woman who was going to play a dominant role in Augustine's life and has some claim to being a late antique mother. Augustine, although he's very influenced by Monica from the beginning, is not baptized as a Christian and appears to have been raised as a pagan, as a youth. Education offered Augustine his ticket out of the boonies and out of North Africa. And he studies both in his hometown at Thasgate and at Carthage, the major city in this part of North Africa. And he decided to focus his academic endeavors on the field of rhetoric, which is the art of speaking and writing persuasively. Romans regarded rhetoric as the ultimate academic pursuit. It's the most impressive, the most prestigious field that one can undertake. If you master rhetoric, there's nothing that you cannot do. And a strong foundation in rhetoric would open up various career opportunities to Augustine and might allow him to leave North Africa and travel to Italy and perhaps even to Rome itself. If you studied rhetoric and mastered it, well, you might become a lawyer, you would be well qualified to become a government official, or you might become a teacher. While he's studying rhetoric in North Africa during his late teens, Augustine also took a concubine. Now, if someone were to introduce you today to his concubine at a cocktail party, you would be taken aback, because concubines have a relatively dubious reputation. But within the Roman Empire, at least in pagan circles, concubinage was regarded as a respectable relationship, and one with legal obligations on both parties. It's an alternative to marriage, and it is suitable for people of different social classes who are forbidden by law to marry. It is suitable for people who want to live in a long-term monogamous relationship with a member of the opposite sex, but one that does not necessarily entail a lifetime commitment to the other person. We know that Augustine spent 15 years with his unnamed concubine, and we know that he had a child, a son, by the name of Adeodatus, who was born probably around 373 and died in 389. Augustine's path to Christianity was long and complicated, and in many ways his life and career encapsulates some of the broader changes that are taking place in the 4th and early 5th centuries. Late in adolescence, he explored Christianity to a certain extent. He was curious about the Christian religion, but upon reading the Christian Bible, he found its Greek to be very plain and poor, and he's an aspiring rhetorician to whom style is everything. And so he decides that Christianity is not for him, and instead he becomes a Manichaean. The religion of Manichaeism had emerged from the Persian Empire during the 3rd century A.D. Its founder is a somewhat obscure figure by the name of Mani. Mani is familiar with Christian writings. He's read the letters of St. Paul. But Manichaeism should not be regarded as an offshoot of Christianity, because it incorporates elements of Persian religion and even of Indian religion as well. As for what Manichaeism taught, Manichaeism maintained that good and evil were equally powerful and equally eternal in the universe, that God and Satan were sort of locked in permanent equilibrium, and neither one nor the other would be able to vanquish their opponent. Matter and the material world, everything that you see around you, has been created by Satan. Spirit and the spiritual world has been created by God, and therefore the material world is wholly evil, wholly corrupt. The spiritual world is wholly good. In Manichaean cosmology, particles of the good spiritual world had become trapped here in the material world. The human soul is such a particle of good that has been trapped, and it is the duty of Manichaean believers to liberate these particles of good so that they can return to the spiritual realm where they belong. And the way for Manichaeans to liberate the good that is trapped in the evil material world is through personal asceticism and through vegetarianism. Augustine was attracted to Manichaeism because it answered an important question that was bothering him, and that was the question of why evil exists in the world. According to Manichaeism, the answer is that evil exists in the world because God, purely good, can't do anything about it. Evil and good are equally powerful, and therefore neither can drive out the other. Although Augustine found this answer, at least as a teenager, to be satisfying, Manichaeans were regarded with horror by contemporary Catholics, and indeed they looked upon Manichees, the way that inhabitants of Middle America looked upon communists in the 1950s. The mere mention of the name Manichae would make the little hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. When Monica found out that Augustine had become a Manichae, she refused to let him in the family house, only relenting later. Augustine wanted to go to the big show, and travel to Italy, and see whether he could make it there as a rhetorician. And he leaves North Africa to go to Rome in 383. He had great expectations for what he would encounter there. The students undoubtedly will be much better than the students in North Africa. After all, they are in Rome. But he was very disappointed by what he encountered there. He found the students relatively apathetic towards their studies. And fairly quickly after going to Rome, he wanted to get out again and find a position elsewhere. He caught a lucky break thanks to the intervention of a Roman official by the name of Symmachus. Symmachus was prefect of the city of Rome, which was a very important office in the Roman Empire. And Symmachus was given the responsibility for appointing a new professor of rhetoric for the city of Milan. This was an especially important teaching post because at this moment in time, Milan was the imperial capital of the western half of the Roman Empire. The emperor and his court were residing in Milan. For much of the 4th century, emperors moved around from city to city. And so Augustine, if he was the chief professor of rhetoric in Milan, he would be responsible for making speeches in front of the whole of the imperial court and in making public speeches on behalf of the emperor. So this was a teaching post that one would keenly like to have. Symmachus himself was a remarkable figure in the late 4th century. He came from an old senatorial family, was very proud of his background, and he's a pagan. And he's openly a pagan in a world that is becoming increasingly Christianized. When the Emperor Gratian yanked the altar of victory out of the Roman Senate house following the death of Julian the Apostate, Symmachus petitions Christian emperors and begs him to restore the altar of victory to its rightful place, which was a fairly courageous stand to take. And he would often intervene with Christian emperors on behalf of pagans. Symmachus, as a pagan, was attracted to Augustine, the Manichaean, because they're both on the outs. And in a way, appointing a Manichaean as a professor of rhetoric in Milan was a jab at Catholicism. And as a result, they formed an alliance of sorts, and Augustine gets the job. Augustine's stay at Milan was going to be relatively brief, only a handful of years, but it was going to be very eventful, in part because of the people whom he was going to encounter in the city. Perhaps the most important acquaintance he made there was with the Christian bishop, Ambrose, whom we encountered in the last lecture. That the Manichaean Augustine and the sort of Catholic bishop Ambrose should encounter each other might seem odd, but Ambrose had a reputation for being a master of rhetoric himself, and so Augustine attended his sermons in order to learn something about good Latin declamation from Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose, in addition to being a master rhetorician, was also a remarkable figure in terms of his personal courage. For during the period of late antiquity,